Ever feel like your brain's stuck on autopilot, like you're just going through the motions?
Totally. It's like we're creatures of habit, right?
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, the science behind those everyday routines we barely even think about. We're exploring The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg.
Oh, I love that book. Duhigg does an amazing job of showing how habits, even the tiny ones, can have this huge impact on our lives.
It's like he's pulling back the curtain on our brains, showing us how these unconscious patterns shape our choices or actions, even who we become.
Absolutely. And one of the most compelling things he does is share these stories, real-life examples of how habits can make or break us.
Right. Like, remember that story about Lisa, the woman who completely transformed her life, seemingly out of nowhere?
Oh, yeah. Quit smoking, paid off her debt, got a new job, even got in shape. It's almost hard to believe someone could change so much so quickly.
Seriously, it seemed impossible, like something out of a movie montage. But the key takeaway, and this is where the habit stuff comes in, is that Lisa didn't do it through sheer willpower.
It wasn't like she just woke up one day with superhuman self-control. It was much more strategic than that.
Right. She focused on changing one key habit, smoking. And get this, that one change, that one crack in the foundation of her old habits, triggered this domino effect, leading to all these positive changes in other parts of her life.
It was like that one good habit became the foundation for a whole new way of living, new identity almost. It's pretty inspiring when you think about it.
So how does that even work? What's going on in our brains when a habit forms?
Well, our brains are kind of lazy, you know? They love to conserve energy. And habits are all about efficiency.
Okay, so our brains are like, let's automate this so we don't have to think about it anymore.
Exactly. Duhigg uses this really helpful example of a rat in a maze.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Little white rat, complex maze. Go on.
So the first time the rat runs through the maze, it's using a ton of brain power, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's actively thinking, exploring, trying to find the reward, which is usually a piece of chocolate or something.
Yeah, it's got to be a pretty motivating reward for all that effort.
Totally. But here's the thing. As the rat learns the path, as it runs the maze over and over, its brain activity actually starts to change. The click of the gate opening becomes a cue, the maze running becomes the routine, and then boom, chocolate reward.
So the rat's brain is basically creating this mental shortcut, this automatic sequence.
Exactly. And eventually, the rat could practically run that maze in its sleep because its brain has internalized the habit loop.
Wow, that's wild. So are you saying our brains are doing the same thing with our everyday habits, like even something as simple as brushing our teeth?
Precisely. Think about it. You don't have to relearn how to brush your teeth every morning. It's just automatic. Your brain goes, cue, waking up, routine, brush, 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 reward. That clean mouth feeling.
Okay, I never thought about it like that, but it makes so much sense. But if habits are so deeply ingrained in our brains, how do we ever break a bad one? Like, are we fighting a losing battle against our own biology?
Well, this is what gets even more interesting. Duhigg talks about this guy, Eugene Pauly, who had severe memory loss because of a virus. He couldn't form new memories at all.
Wow, that's awful. So anything that happened to him, he'd just forget.
Pretty much. He couldn't remember what he'd just done a minute ago, let alone learn something new.
It's hard to imagine living like that.
It was a really tough situation. But here's the incredible part. Even though he couldn't form new conscious memories, Eugene could still develop new habits. Researchers noticed that he took walks every day, the same route, same time.
Wait, so he had no memory of ever taking those walks before, but his body was still going through the motions.
It's crazy, right? And it highlights something really important. Habits aren't just about conscious memory. They operate on these separate neurological pathways.
So even if you feel like you're stuck with a bad habit, like it's just part of who you are, this shows us that change is still possible.
Exactly. Our brains are capable of incredible change, even on a subconscious level.
Okay, so our brains are basically habit-making machines, even when we don't realize it. But how do those habits actually get created in the first place? Is it just repetition? Do we just do something enough times and then, bam, habit?
Well, repetition is definitely part of it, but it goes deeper than that. Remember that habit loop we were talking about with the rat in the maze?
Right, the cue, the routine, and the reward. So it's not just about doing something over and over, it's about the context, the triggers, and what we get out of it.
Exactly. Those three elements are essential for understanding how any habit, whether it's a good one or a bad one, really takes root in our brains.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does this play out in the real world, outside of a lab with a rat and a maze? Can you give me an example?
Absolutely. Duhigg talks about this guy, Claude Hopkins, a legendary ad man back in the day. He's the guy who basically made Pepsodent toothpaste a household name.
Pepsodent. Really? I mean, it's toothpaste. What's so habit-forming about that?
Well, here's the thing. Back then, most people didn't brush their teeth regularly. It wasn't like it is now, this daily ritual that we just do without thinking.
Wow, that's hard to imagine. Brushing your teeth, it's like showering or something. You just do it. You have to. But Hopkins changed all that.
He did. And he did it by understanding the power of the habit loop. He realized he needed to create a craving, something that people would start doing automatically without even thinking about it.
Okay, so how to do that? Did he just tell people their breath stunk?
Kinda, but it was more
Yeah.
clever than that. He needed a cue, right? Something that would trigger the routine of brushing. And he found it, that feeling of film on your teeth.
Oh, yeah. You know that feeling when you haven't brushed in a while and you run your tongue over your teeth and it's like, ugh, all fuzzy?
Exactly. Most people had that feeling all the time because they weren't brushing regularly. So Hopkins turned that into a problem that needed solving.
And Pepsodent was the solution.
Bingo. But here's the really brilliant part. He didn't just focus on the problem, the film. He emphasized the reward, the feeling of clean, beautiful teeth.
So he linked this simple routine brushing with Pepsodent to a desirable outcome.
Exactly. But there's one more piece to this puzzle. Remember we talked about cravings. Hopkins knew he needed to make people crave Pepsodent, not just see it as a way to get rid of that icky film.
Okay, so how do you do that? What's so crave-worthy about toothpaste?
Well, Pepsodent, and this is where it gets interesting, contained citric acid and mint oil. And those ingredients created a slight tingling sensation when you brushed.
Ah, so it wasn't just about cleaning your teeth. It was about that fresh, tingly feeling afterward.
Exactly. People started associating that tingle, that little burst of sensory reward, with the feeling of cleanliness and freshness.
So they were hooked. But this craving thing, it makes me think about all those products that are designed to make us want them, even if we don't really need them.
Oh, absolutely. Think about Febreze, that fabric spray.
Oh, yeah. I love that stuff. It's like instant freshness, even if my apartment is a disaster zone. But how does that fit in with the habit loop?
Well, when Febreze first launched, they marketed it as a solution for bad smells, which logically makes sense, right?
Yeah, get rid of the stink. But it didn't work.
Not really. Turns out people don't love to be reminded that their house might smell bad. It's kind of embarrassing.
That makes sense. No one wants to walk into a store and be like, hey, I need to cover up the fact that my dog smells.
Exactly. So Febreze was struggling, but then they had this aha moment.
Yeah.
What if, instead of focusing on the problem, the bad smell, they focused on the reward, the feeling of freshness?
So they shifted their marketing to be all about that clean, just washed everything scent.
Yep, they tapped into that craving for a sensory experience that feels good.
It's like how that smell of freshly baked bread makes you want to buy a loaf, even if you went to the store for vegetables.
You got it. They turned Febreze into a reward, not just a solution. And that, my friend, is the power of the habit loop at work. And it's not just consumer products either. This stuff applies in all areas of life, even in the most unexpected places.
Like where? Give me another example. I'm hooked.
How about the football field?
Football. Okay, now I'm really curious. What does tackling quarterbacks have to do with habits?
Duhigg talks about Tony Dungy, the coach who led the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to victory in the Super Bowl. He was famous for his calm demeanor, his strategic mind, but also for his deep understanding of habits.
So instead of just yelling at his players to try harder, he was using habits to improve their performance.
Exactly. He understood that real lasting change came from rewiring those automatic behaviors, those split-second decisions that happen on the field.
So what kind of habits are we talking about?
Dungy focused on changing small, specific habits, like how players reacted to certain plays, their footwork, their formations. He drilled these routines over and over until they became second nature.
So he was basically rewiring their brains one play at a time to create a winning team.
Exactly. He knew that by changing these small habits, he could create a cascade of positive changes, which would ultimately lead to better performance and, victories.
That's incredible. It really shows how powerful it can be to focus on the process, the small wins that build on each other. But I'm curious, can this same concept apply to larger groups? Like, can you use habits to shape the behavior of, say, a whole company or even a social movement? So we've seen how these habit loops play out in our personal lives, from brushing our teeth to how we behave at the supermarket. But what about on a larger scale? Can this same concept apply to groups of people, even entire societies?
Absolutely. Duhigg dives into that, and it's pretty fascinating stuff. He uses the Montgomery bus boycott as an example.
Oh, wow. The Montgomery bus boycott, that's going back a bit. I remember learning about it in school, but not so much about the habits involved. How does that even work on such a large scale?
Think of it this way. The boycott's success wasn't just about Rosa Parks' single act of defiance. I mean, that was obviously a huge turning point.
Yeah.
But the boycott itself, the way it spread and gained momentum, that was all about social habits.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this. So it wasn't just about one person's actions. It was about how those actions tap into something larger, a sort of collective behavior pattern.
You got it. First, you have Rosa Parks' close friends and family, her strong ties. They were outraged, ready to take a stand and support her. That makes sense, right?
Oh, absolutely. That immediate visceral reaction.
Exactly. But the boycott wouldn't have become a movement without the weaker ties, acquaintances, church members, people who knew of Rosa Parks but didn't necessarily know her personally. Those connections were crucial for spreading the word and getting people involved.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's like a ripple effect going outward. But how did they get those weaker ties on board? It's one thing to be outraged on someone's behalf, but it's another thing to completely change your routine, to inconvenience yourself for a cause, even an important one.
You're right, it's not easy to break out of those comfortable routines, but that's where social habits are so powerful. These people saw their community taking a stand. They saw their friends, their neighbors, people they respected, choosing to walk instead of ride the bus.
So it was less about making a rational decision and more about that feeling of, well, if everyone else is doing it, maybe I should too.
Exactly. It's that sense of shared identity, of doing what we do. It's incredibly motivating. Think about it. We see this all the time in all sorts of contexts. Like, think about when you finally get into a good workout routine. It's not just about the exercise itself.
No, definitely not. It's about becoming the kind of person who values their health. It's about fitting in at the gym, being part of that community.
Exactly. And Duhigg shows how this same principle, this power of social habits, played out in a very different setting. The rise of Saddleback Church.
Saddleback. I know it's one of those mega churches, but how does that connect to habits?
It's all about the founder, Rick Warren. He was really smart about this stuff. He realized that people crave community, a sense of belonging. So what did he do? He created these small groups where people could connect on a personal level, share their lives, support each other.
So it wasn't just about showing up for a service on Sunday morning. It was about making church a part of your lifestyle, your social circle.
Exactly. He made church attendance a habit, something people looked forward to, something they'd feel weird if they missed.
It's brilliant when you think about it, even if you're not a religious person yourself. But it does make you think, if habits can be this powerful force for good, like with the boycott and Saddleback, what about the flip side? Can they also be harmful?
That's a really important point. And yet, Duhigg addresses that. He talks about the King's Crossfire, a horrific event in London back in the 80s. It was a tragic example of how even well-intentioned habits, when taken to an extreme, can have unintended consequences.
Oh, wow. The King's Crossfire, that was devastating. But how does that relate to habits? It was a fire, right? An accident.
It was. But it wasn't just a random accident. Duhigg explains how the London Underground at the time had this deeply ingrained culture of following procedures, almost to a fault. Each department had its own set of rules, and employees were basically discouraged from deviating from them, even if common sense said otherwise.
So it's a case of people being so focused on following the rules, so stuck in their routines, that they missed the warning signs or were afraid to speak up.
Exactly. There were actually warning signs about fire hazards, but they were ignored because they didn't fit the usual procedures. It was like their brains were so locked into those routines that they couldn't adapt when it mattered most.
It's a chilling example of how even habits we think of as good, like being organized, following the rules, can become liabilities if we're not careful.
Absolutely. It's all about balance, right?
Ooh.
We need those routines and systems to function in the world, but we also need to be able to adapt, to think critically, and to question those routines when they're no longer serving us.
It makes you wonder about all the habits we have in our own lives, the ones we don't even question because they've become so automatic.
It's true. Duhigg's book really makes you think about these things. He has this whole section on how companies are using our habits, often without us even realizing it.
Yeah, like that crazy story about Target figuring out that a woman was pregnant before her own family knew.
Oh yeah, that was wild. Target was analyzing customer data and realized they could identify certain buying patterns that strongly correlated with pregnancy.
Like they cracked the code of pregnant lady shopping habit.
Exactly. And they use that information to send targeted coupons and ads, hoping to make Target the go-to store for all things baby.
Wow, that's both impressive and kind of creepy. Like big data knows us better than we know ourselves.
Right. It definitely raises some ethical questions about privacy and how our data is being used.
Totally. But back on the individual level, all this talk about how our habits can be predicted, influenced, it makes me wonder, can we actually change our habits for good? Or are we, to some extent, stuck with the habits we've formed over the years?
It's a question a lot of us ask ourselves.
Right.
But Duhigg says that understanding the habit loop, that cue routine reward cycle, is the first step. We often aren't even aware of what's really driving our habits. Like, we might think we're craving a sugary snack in the afternoon, but what we really crave is a break from work, a little social interaction,
So instead of trying to resist the cookie, maybe we just need to find a different way to satisfy that craving.
Exactly. That's where it gets empowering. Instead of being a slave to our habits, we can start to identify the real needs behind those behaviors and find new routines to meet those needs.
So it's about changing the routine, not just resisting it with willpower.
Exactly. Duhigg talks about creating what he calls implementation intentions.
Implementation intentions. Okay, sounds a little intimidating.
It's simpler than it sounds. It's basically just about having a plan. It's about saying, okay, when I encounter this cue, when I have this craving, instead of going on autopilot, I'm going to do this instead.
Like when I get that 3 p.m. craving for a cookie, instead of hitting up the vending machine, I'm going to walk over to a coworker's desk and chat for a few minutes.
Exactly. It's about consciously choosing a different path, rewiring those automatic responses, and over time, those new choices become the new habits.
I love that. It's empowering. It makes change seem possible, even those deeply ingrained habits that feel like they're just part of who we are.
That's the power of understanding how our brains work.
It's been fascinating diving into this with you. Any final thoughts for our listeners as we wrap up our exploration of the power of habit?
Well, Duhigg leaves us with this really thought-provoking idea. He says that our habits, even the ones we don't think about, reveal a lot about who we are. But they don't have to define who we become. We have the power to choose different paths, to create habits that reflect the best version of ourselves, not just the habits we've fallen into along the way.
That's a great point to end on. What one small habit could you change today that might set you on a different path, a path towards that best version of yourself? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.